This is the Rutlands 255mm table saw. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to assemble it, how to make all the necessary adjustments, and also an overall review of the machine itself. Now, full disclaimer, I am not associated to Rutlands in any way. I've bought this saw with my own money. We'll start at the front of the machine here, and we'll start with the on and off button. So simple, green for on, and there's a red button underneath which powers it off. You've got a flappy panel here, which is good because in a moment of panic, you can just punch that and that will turn the machine off. So you don't have to try and figure out and fiddle around when you're in a panic to try and press that button. You can just punch that panel and it works pretty well. The panel also has a hole underneath here, which is a hole which you can put a padlock through. And that's really useful. You can thread a padlock through and that locks the panel down and permanently keeps that off button engaged. So if you've got kids that like to play with blades at 5,000 RPM, then that is a great way where they can't accidentally turn it on. We've got the main wheel here, and this is what you use to turn left to right, and that's what raises and lowers the blade. It is made of plastic, but it does feel like a strong plastic. It doesn't feel like it's going to break after the first use. So to the right of the wheel, we've got the angle adjustment lever, and that's what controls the angle of the blade so you can make angled cuts. So you can see here, you've got a gauge that goes from 0 to 15, 22 and a half, 30, all the way up to 45 degrees. And you just lift this up, and then that releases this whole wheel, and then you can choose wherever you want it to go. So let's say we'll put it on to 30. You can then push the lever back down, and then that securely keeps it in place. It doesn't have a click. It's not one of them things where you can tell exactly that it's engaged. However, it does securely fasten, and that's not going anywhere. You try and move this and you're moving the whole unit. So that is securely in place. Lift the lever back up and you can put it back to 0. When you first get the saw out of the box, you're going to see this little thing here, and this is what this knob and bolt does. It's what controls the rack and pinion fence. So really simple, you just line it up, put the screw in, and then you can tighten it with the Allen key that comes with the machine. Once that's attached, you can then turn it, and that's what controls the rack and pinion fence. We'll talk about the fence more when we get to the top of the saw. And then on the bottom right of the front of the machine, you've got a hole which fits the push stick. That is an awesome design. It's not on the side, it's not in a stupid location where it's hard to reach. You can just stand in front of the saw, pull it out, use it, easy work, and then just push it back in. That is a great design, and I wish more saws did that. Moving on to the right side of the machine, you've got handholds here, and then you've got also a handhold here, and that's what I use to bring out the house, so I know that's already strong and easy to use. Inside the machine and the back here, you can see there's a wing nut you can take off, and then you can get your 2 spanners or wrenches or whatever you want to call them, which is what you can use to take out the blade from the arbor. Now looking at the back of the saw, we've got the dust extraction pipe, which is 63mm in diameter. The saw also comes with a dust pipe adapter, and all that does is you push it in, and that transforms that 63mm diameter to a 35mm. There are 2 plastic holes here which you can use to thread the Mitre gauge into. I love that design. It feels strong and sturdy. It doesn't seem like it's going to fall out when you're using it. I love it when saws have places where you can put the accessories from the saw onto the saw itself, so you don't have to find like a random place in your shed or on the wall where you can put this. You can just leave it straight on the saw when it's not being used. I love that design. To the left side of the machine, you've got the 2 plastic prongs which you can wrap around your cable like I've done here. It's around 2 meters long, this cable, and it's a 230 volt plug. Inside you've also got the 2000 watt motor. At the back next to the motor, you see a wing nut with a bolt, and that's what you use to adjust the tracking of the blade. If you find that the blade's just slightly askew left or right, then you can adjust that wing nut, loosen it, and then tighten the bolt left or right with your hands depending on which direction you want it to go. I'm not going to adjust that just yet because I'm not sure if the blade actually needs tracking itself, but once we get to the top of the saw and we start doing the adjustments, we'll then come back to this if we need it. Moving on to the top of the saw now, this is where I've got to do all my adjustments. And first of all, I want to see if this table is actually flat. So I've got a straight edge here, and it's always hard to show this on camera, but it looks pretty good. Yeah, I've got no issues with that. There's no spaces at all. There's a slight space. You can see where the throat plate is. There's a slight space there, but I'll show you in a little while how to adjust that so it's flush with the rest of the table. Now, looking at the throat plate, it doesn't come with a zero clearance insert. This is more of a generic one that loads of saws do, so it can accommodate for the angle cuts as well. But to open this, you just get any old flat piece of metal or anything that can open this. You just give it a little twist, and there's a finger hold here that you can use to pull it up. Just be aware that if you want to make your own zero clearance inserts of these, that they've got little plastic tabs at the end here, which will make it a bit more harder if you're going to try and make your own out of wood. You've got 4 grub screws here, which do not screw into anything inside of the throat plate. So these aren't what hold it into place. It's just this piece of plastic and the piece of plastic that you twist here. The grub screws are to level the throat plate along with the table. To level the throat plate with the rest of the saw, I'm just going to put it back in for now. I'm going to leave it unlocked. Using a straight edge here, I'm going to put it near to the grub screws, and I can see that there's a fine gap that runs underneath that. So what we're going to do is we're going to tighten these grub screws, and that's going to raise the plate up and reach that level. So now when you run your thumb across, your finger across now, that should sit level. Just got to do the same with the back screws and then we're done. So let's take a look at the saw blade and the Riving knife itself. So what I've done is I'll just take the throat plate off and I've raised that blade as high as it will go, and that will just give you more access to the parts inside. I'm going to start with the Riving knife here. Now before I start fiddling around with it, it's important to consider that you cannot physically take the Riving knife out of the saw. You can adjust the height of it in 2 different locations, but you cannot physically take this part out of the saw. It's not a huge issue for me because I live in the UK. We don't have access to things like dado blades like the Americans do, which would require you to pull out the Riving knife. However, it's important to consider if you need to take that out for your own projects, then you might need to reconsider getting this saw. To adjust the Riving knife, there is a small silver lever by the side of it that you can just pull up, and that disengages the spring lock of the Riving knife. You can then push it to the side and then you can raise it up. And there are set holes on the side of the Riving knife. There's only 2, but once you pull it up, you can then re-engage it with another hole, and then you can re-engage that lock itself. And now you can see that the Riving knife now sits higher up on the blade. Even though you can't take the Riving knife off, it is flush. There's nothing stopping you from using a cross-cut sled, which was a massive concern of mine because I used to have a table saw where there used to be metal prongs on the side of it, and that was for the blade guard, and that would stop you from putting a cross-cut sled onto it. But however, this is all flush, so you're going to have no issue using a cross-cut sled. So with the Riving knife, you want it to be in line with the teeth of the blade. Now, stock is actually pretty good. If I just rotate the blade here, it's actually perfectly in line. You can see that there's a tooth either side of that blade, and that's bang on, straight out the box. But let me show you how to adjust that if yours isn't the same. So next to the Riving knife here, you've got 2 bolts, and when you loosen them, then you should be able to freely move that Riving knife to whichever position you want, and then retighten them and then try and get that back in line with the blade. I'm not going to show it because it's already spot on perfect and I don't want to mess around with it, but that is how you adjust it so it is perfectly in line with the blade. So now I'm going to have a look at taking the blade off. Now, safety warning, please wear gloves because I've already cut myself on this blade once. Using the 2 spanners that come with the saw, earlier I showed you where you can find that. You're going to place one on one side, and each spanner will have to go different directions. So to loosen it, the spanner that's in my left hand, I'm rotating that towards the user. And then once you've loosened that, you can do the rest of your fingers. And then once you drop it down into the machine, which you'll never ever get again, you can then pull off the blade. Yeah, that's annoying. Yeah, I'm going to pretend I did that for the video so I can show you this cool little gizmo thing. So it's just an extendable little pole and it's got a magnet on the end. And you should just be able to reach in. And then, how epic is that? £3. It's the most epic thing I've ever seen in my life. This is the blade they supply of the saw itself. So it's a 255mm blade with a 30mm bore, and it's a 2.8mm thickness. It's a 24 tooth blade. I don't know how good it is. I haven't really seen any reviews about how good these blades are, but for the sake of the purpose of the video, I'm going to use it. I do have another blade that I bought to go instead of this, which I'll probably use after I've made this review, but just for the sake of it, I'll use this one. So now let's have a look at the blade guard. Now, the blade guard is just regular cheap plastic. There is no dust extraction area on it where you can attach a vacuum. That's the only dust extraction you get is at the bottom and the rear of the saw. To attach this, there is just a spring loaded screw that you push, and you can also twist, and that's how you attach it to the riving knife. To attach it to the riving knife, there is a hole here, and you're going to line that bolt with that hole. Now, before I show this, it is very important that you have the riving knife at its most top height, because if you put it at the bottom bit, it will make contact with the blade, and the first time you turn it on, it will just explode into a million pieces and it'll probably hurt. So with the top of the hole here, you're going to thread it through and then line it up with that bolt. Once you get it in, you can then push whilst you're turning the wheel, and then that will secure, and then you can, there we go. Now, my personal preference is to not use a blade guard at all. I know you can say that it's unsafe, and I know I've got to cut my finger from touching the saw blade, but ignore that argument. I like to see where that saw blade is at all times, and even though this is clear plastic, I feel that still obstructs my view a little bit. So personal preference, I don't like to have this on, but by all means, you're very welcome to use it yourself. I just don't prefer it. Going to put the fence on now, so you've got 2 bolts at the front and then 2 bolts at the back. Depending on where you put the fence on, if it's this one or that one, most of the time you're going to be wanting to put the fence onto this one, because that means you can get the fence close to the blade, and that's where you're going to do the majority of your cuts. If you put the fence on this one, that means that the fence will be further away and you can adjust it further away, and that's where you're going to be using more of your sheet goods, your wider rip cuts. But for the demonstration purposes, I'm going to put it onto this. So to attach it, you just line the desired bolt up with this little groove bit here. It is the exact same process on the back of the saw. I'm not going to show you in the video, but you just follow that exact guide, and then you push both the front and the back of the levers down, and that secures it into place. Now that you've got a fence attached, you can move the rack and pinion fence back and forth. And to lock it into place, there's a lever down here that you push down, makes a click, and then that fence is locked in. That's not going anywhere. You can't adjust it anyway, and that is not moving anywhere. Just like the wheel, if you try and move the wheel or the fence, you're moving the whole unit instead, so that's not going anywhere. So I want to see if this fence is in line with the mitre slot, and then will be parallel to the blade. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to get a straight piece of metal, push it against the fence. Now I've already adjusted the fence so that the mitre slot is in line with this part of the fence. It's really hard to see on camera. You can see it slightly, but the fence, the more longer it goes down, it slightly askews to the left. So there's no lip here, but then once you get here, there's a bit of a lip. So we just need to adjust that fence just so it's a bit more straight, and I'll show you how to do that now. So I flip the saw around now, so we're towards the rear of the saw, and you can see a bit more what I mean. So there's now a lip to the fence where there wasn't one down here, it was all flush, and now there's a bit of a lip. So we're going to move the fence ever so slightly this way so it straightens up. So first we're just going to pull the levers up from the front and back of the saw, and we're just going to loosen this bolt here, and then you should have a bit of free rein ever so slightly again to adjust that where you need it to be. So I'm just going to use my straight level here, just catching a bit of a lip there, so I'm just going to bring it over a touch. See, we're good there now. You see how we're now flush with the fence to the mitre slot. So now what we're in place, I'm just going to tighten that bolt up again. And just double check that we're still the same at the back. Once you're finished using these bolts, you then need to repeat the process with the other bolts because they're independent of each other. So you'll need to do the exact same process of this with the other two bolts as well. Once that's done, you can then see we are flush from start to finish. So now the next adjustment we need to make is make sure that this, the mitre slot and the fence, are in line with the blade itself. Before we go any further, let's just see if we're square. And I think we're pretty good. There's a hairline crack in it, but then that could just be down to my square because it is a cheap one. But I think we are looking pretty good. Let's just see if this fence is straight. And it is, good. So let's talk about the fence a bit more. So it's made of aluminium. And it even has a second fence. And let me show you how that works. So the second fence fits in between these two springs here. And the way you release it, you can just pull it out. Now there are two slots. So let me show you the first one, which is the top one. So all you're gonna do is you're gonna push the bolt in. And now that works as a shorter, lower down fence. Now the adjustment below it is particularly useful because now this adds a support for when you're doing large sheet goods. So let me show you what I mean. So let's say, for example, I want to rip this huge piece of plywood. Now I can use that little lip there as a support along the fence for me to rest it on. So now I've got additional support to hold this plywood up, and then I can make the cut and push it through, and I can still use it against the fence. Once you've got your adjustment fence on, then you've got a rip capacity of just over 63 centimeters. Another really cool feature to this fence is that if you don't need it, let's say you're going to be using a crosscut sled and it's going to get in your way, all you can do is release the levers, pull the flappy metal panel out, and that helps you get it off. And then you can tuck it underneath the fence, reconnect it, make sure that metal flange is going in the gap, reconnect it to the back as well, put the levers down, and now you've got a strong, sturdy place to store the fence when you don't need to use it. How cool is that? So now I want to see if the blade is parallel to the mitre slot itself. So the way I'm going to do that is I've got a straight edge. I'm going to buff that up against the front of the blade. Make sure you're not touching any of the teeth because they do protrude out a little bit. And I can see there, if the camera captures it, that we're bang on 10 centimeters where that slot starts. So now if I move the blade towards the back, and we'll repeat the process at the back. Bang on 10 again, look. Now if that wasn't accurate, that's where you can use the wing nut and that bolt that's on the side of the machine to adjust that, and that's what adjusts the tracking of the blade. So now I want to see if the blade is a perfect 90 to the table itself. So I've got my square here, buff that up against the blade, make sure to avoid using the teeth again because they do protrude out, and that is bang on. You can also use a digital level like I've got here. So I've got it set to 0. I've zeroed it out to this already. And I'm going to push that onto the blade. It's magnetic and perfect, 90 degree. So now what we know this is a perfect 90, I'm just going to have a look to see if the wheel represents that it is also a perfect 90. Once you've set the saw blade to a perfect 90, then you want to look back at your graph here, which tells you which angle that blade is currently sitting on. You want the needle to be spot on 0. Now out of the box, mine is pretty much spot on 0, but if yours is slightly to the left or slightly to the right, then it's a real simple way of adjusting it. There's a screw down at the bottom here that you can loosen up, and then that will give you movement of the needle to go left or right, so then you can set it to 0 yourself. Now that the blade is set at 90, and I've also got the angle set at 90, now there's a little bolt behind the wheel. It's very hard for me to show on camera, but this acts as a stop block for the wheel mechanism itself. Now to explain that a bit more, if I was to release the angle lever on the side here, this wheel still has a small amount of play to come down to the left. Now tilting it to the left would then take it out of 90. What this bolt does is it acts as a stop block, so every time I use the lever and I bring the wheel back down to 0, it will hit that bolt, use it as a stop block, so every time I hit it, I know that the blade will be at a perfect 90. So now that it's loose, I want to push that up as high as I can up against that wheel, and then I can try, emphasis on try, to tighten that back up. Now that's tightened up, let's see if that works, and when I release the lever and bring it back down, that we go back to a perfect 90. So let's just try that real quick. So I'm going to release it, pretend I made a cut at a certain angle, and then I'm going to bring it back down. Once I hit that stop block, I can then re-engage it. Now that we've adjusted the stop block, let's see if this can still go back to a perfect 90. So I'm just going to 0 off again, and then bump that up against the blade, and yeah, perfect 90. Awesome. Just like the bolt that we just tightened to get the perfect 90, there's also a second bolt which we use to get a perfect 45. So let's adjust that now. Just gonna loosen that real quick, and you should be able to move that, there you go, back and forth. So let's repeat the process here. So it's zeroed off and connect it, avoid the teeth, and we're 0.3 off. So let's adjust that real quick. So get that to a perfect 45. So I've re-engaged the lever now, so that blade isn't going to go left or right, and I just need to re-tighten it here, which is a little bit awkward. And then once you tighten that, let's just see if that works. So now if we undo that lever and pretend we're doing a different cut, and then we're going to put it back to 45. And then when you re-engage that, let's see if that's gonna perfect 45. So now that we can move that blade up and down, and it will hit a perfect 90 and it will hit a perfect 45. The only thing I've noticed about making them two adjustments is now that the needle is no longer in line with a 45. If I brought this down to 0, it would be perfectly on 0, but that doesn't show us a perfect 45. So I'm going to recommend every time you want to do an angle cut, then you just use that digital gauge and make sure that you're actually tightening it at the right angle. So now that we want to see if this red needle that points to how wide we're going to cut, relevance to the fence, we need to see if this is also accurate. So I've bumped up the fence all the way up into the blade. So now this needle here should say 0. Let's take a look. So I can see that the needle is slightly pointing more to the left. So I'm going to make that adjustment. So there's a hex bolt here that you can undo. Once you loosen that, then you've got free reign again of where you can put that needle. So let's see if we can get that spot on 0. I've noticed there is a very slight angle to this needle that seems to be with the fence itself. So I can't get that spot on 0. However, I think that's probably as close as I'm going to get it. So let's talk about the mitre gauge that comes with the saw. Now, I think it's a well-known fact that mitre gauges on any table saw, whether that be a 100 quid budget saw to a 2,000 quid saw stop, they just never seem to be perfect. And I think there's two reasons for that. One, this is a budget saw after all, so I don't expect it to be great. And two, it's so they can sell you a super epic cool one on their website separately for almost 1/3 of the cost of the table saw itself. Now Rutlands do that, and there are a few mitre gauges on their website if you want to buy a better one. However, I'd probably recommend trying to find one from a third-party website. The Mitre gauge fence is made of aluminium, but the dials in and where the angles, it is a plastic knob on a plastic bracket. To adjust it, you just loosen the plastic knob and then you can change that angle to whatever you like. And you see you've got the angles here. One thing that I would like to see an improvement on it, and it's not necessarily an expensive improvement, is I would like to see divots along the edge. So with some of the decent Mitre saws, you should be able to just find a angle that's commonly used, let's say 45, and it should have a little divot where you can click it in and then tighten it up, and then that way you can get consistent cuts. This doesn't have it, it's just plastic on plastic, and you do have to just choose the angle by eye, which isn't great, but it's a budget saw again at the end of the day, so you're going to get what you pay for. So another thing I noticed with this Mitre gauge is when you insert it into the slot, it does have a very slight wobble to it. Now it's only probably a hair's width, but it's got a very slight move to it. Now before you ask, there is no adjustments you can make on the bottom of it that makes it slightly more fatter. This is how it comes, and this is just how you're going to have to deal with it. The Mitre slot itself does seem to be working well. It doesn't seem to be catching on anything. It doesn't seem to be swerving or anything silly like that. The Mitre gauge does glide well, probably because it's small. Let's see if this gauge is square. That's not good. And you can see the light coming from the other side there. And you can see it's touching the bottom, but not the top. There's a fair gap. And there's no way to change that either, so suck eggs, really. Now there are little wing nuts here that you can undo, and that's what you use to bring the fence back and forth. But it's when you then retighten them, where you can see ever so slightly that fence then goes out of square. If you look here, ever so slightly, when I tighten that nut up, it brings it just out of level, and that's what's causing the issue. But you can't use this with these loose, because then your fence is going to be all over the place. So now I put the Mitre gauge into the slot, and now we're going to make an adjustment to this needle here. Now for me, where I'm standing right now, that needle is pointing exactly at 0. However, if I bump my square up against the Mitre gauge and then up against the saw blade, you can see that we're touching the blade here at the front, but then there's a big gap towards the back. So this gauge isn't as square as it's telling me. Now this adjustment is really simple to fix. So we're going to start off by loosening the plastic knob here, and then that gives the ability for the Mitre gauge to correct itself. Now we're going to do the same process again. We're going to bump the square up against the Mitre gauge and also the saw blade. Once you're flat against the saw blade, then when you push the Mitre gauge towards the square, it will correct itself. Then once you've done that, you're going to re-tighten that plastic knob. So now we know the blade is square to the Mitre gauge. Now that I've made that adjustment though, the needle is now a fraction to the right of the 0. So now we need to adjust this needle here with just either a flathead or a Phillips. And then you can rotate that needle to wherever you want. But I'm going to try and get that as square onto 0 as I can. There we go. So now I know that the Mitre gauge is square to the blade, and now that this needle is pointing exactly on 0 as it should be. So we're ready to start cutting. Finally, we've got 4 different types of wood, starting from a soft 2x4 pine, which is used for interior stud work, and then we're going to move on to oak, and then maple, and then also some really thick sapele. So I've also got some plywood out back that I'll use the adjustable fence with the extension to see how good that works as well. Got my dust extraction pipe in, so we get to see how good the dust extraction is, but let's get ready to cut. So first impressions of the saw, really good. It produced a really clean cut. I have no issues with that. There's one slight mark, but then that could be down to user error. The dust extraction, there is a bit of dust on the table, and that's just through one pass. I do get it is 2-inch thick wood, so it is hard for the machine to actually try and extract that dust. But if you're going to be working with this inside of the house and you plan to use thick lumber, let's say using this pine for stud walling, that might become an issue. You might just have to vacuum this every couple of passes to make sure that none of the dust blows off from the top of the surface. On a positive note, that blade stopped really quickly when I turned it off. I don't recall seeing on the website about an electric brake. However, that stopped within 2 or 3 seconds, which is a pretty good safety feature, and it means that you can get your wood out of it quicker and you don't have to wait 5 or 6 seconds for that blade to stop. So the next thing I'm going to be cutting is a slab of oak. This is 3 centimeters thick, so just over an inch. That is a really good cut. You got very, very light marking all the way up it, but then that's to be expected with a 24 tooth blade. No burning whatsoever, and this is over an inch of oak, so that is a really good result. I'm happy with that. Now let's try with an inch thick hard maple. Of all the woods, this has actually produced the best cut. There's no markings whatsoever, no burning. Right, no more playing around. Let's see how good this all can do. We're doing sapele now, which is 7.5 centimeters thick, which is over 2 3/4 inch. So if it can cut through this, I will be impressed. This is the end result here, and overall, really good cut. There's a slight bit of burning down here where it started. That could have been down to user error, but to be quite honest, it is almost 3 inches of a hardwood. Sapele is I believe it's a species of mahogany, so you know that's going to be really hard and tough to work with anyway. So that's kind of to be expected. All in all, I can run my hand along it, and I'm not scared of getting any splinters. So really good cut, considering how thick it is. This is the offcut of wood that it just came off, and there's less marks on this than there was on the actual piece of wood itself. There's no burning, no marking again. Overall, solid cut. That was 18mm ply. Looks good. Let's try and get some angle cuts in. So I've got the blade set to 45 degrees. I've got another piece here of 2x4 pine. Let's see if we can get a good 45 angle. Now I noticed when I was running that wood through that it was coming away from the fence towards the end there, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate of a cut this is going to be. Let me get my angle finder and see how good of an angle this actually is. Right, let's just see if this is a 45. Yeah, it's pretty good. Let's just check the other end. And yes, cool. I'm happy with that result. Right, let's have a look at that cut then. You can see there's a slight gap. I mean, it starts off really good, but then there's a slight gap towards the end. That could be down to a couple of things. It could be down to the mitre gauge wobbling around the slot. It could be the wood itself pushing itself away from the blade because it's hard to hold it down with that mitre gauge of how wobbly it is. But it's manageable, I think. So I'm going to use the mitre gauge now to try and make a cross cut. I'm going to use the same oak plank as I just did to do the rip cut because I know that that's a straight cut, and hopefully with a good cross cut I can get that corner at a perfect square. Let's see if that's a square cut. That is pretty good. There are no gaps in that, so we've set that up perfectly. So that's it. Overall, I could not be more happy with this table saw. Everything about it, whether it be the adjustments, the power, the accuracy of it, it's just far exceeded my expectations of a budget saw. The fence, originally I was a bit concerned of how light it was. I thought it was going to be really susceptible to be pushed out of position if you're using a heavier wood, but that wasn't the case. It's just kept there, it's stayed strong, and it's kept a really good straight cut. The motor, I suppose only time will tell how long that will last, although it does seem powerful enough to do everything that I need it to do. And it's also cut through a really hard sapele wood, which is about 3 inches thick, so I've got no issues there. The blade, for a default blade, I suppose it's really good. If you want a finer finish, then you'll have to buy your own blade with more teeth on it. I think Rutlands, on their website, they do a finer tooth blade if you wanted one. The rack and pinion fence, again, I cannot fault it whatsoever. Especially for the price of this saw to be in this budget range, you do not get many saws with a rack and pinion fence, so that is a really good feature for such a cheap saw. The tabletop of the saw, again, is really good. I don't think I said it in the video, but it is made of cast aluminium, but no issues there. It seems to hold up well, and after this video I'll probably give it a quick once over some wax just to help the wood glide across a bit, but really happy with the tabletop as well. Now, this saw doesn't come without some of its flaws though. Now, they're not major flaws. I don't think it's any reason why you shouldn't get this table saw. However, it's just a couple of things that I've picked up on now that I've used it a couple of times. I think it goes without saying, the mitre gauge isn't very good. I don't know if it's a case of I've just got a manufacturer defect, but I don't like it that that isn't square to the table itself. It's okay for things under 1 inch, but then if it's anything over 1 inch, then there might be a bit of a rocking motion with it. And also the fact that it moves around in the mitre slot itself, again, you're talking about a millimetre. I'm not going to do any precision work with that thing. Another thing that I felt was a bit awkward was the push stick holder itself. Now, early in the video, I was saying about how good it was. And to be honest, I still think it is a really good design. However, I would only use it to store the push stick. Originally, I thought that when I was making the cut, I could quickly pull it out, use it, and then push it back in. However, because it's plastic on plastic, and after it's collected a bit of dust as well, which, let's be honest, only takes a cut or two, it starts to jam up, it starts to get really sticky, and it starts to get really hard to try and pull it out at a moment's notice. Because of that, I just left the push stick out somewhere nearby that I can use it as and when I need to use it. But I wouldn't leave it in there and then go to reach for it when I'm trying to make a cut. Another thing that you need to consider is the dust extraction itself. Now, it's not terrible. Anything under 1 inch seems to work pretty good. Anything over 1 inch and you're going to start spreading dust all over the place. That being said, I think it's quite hard for table saws at any price range to collect all of the dust, especially the dust that comes off the top of the wood, because it's just so far away from that extraction that it's not going to go out. Tying that in with the blade guard that doesn't have an extraction pipe in it, there's no way you can really counter that dust getting thrown back out onto the table saw and into your face. So that's just something that you need to consider if dust extraction is a big issue for you. Another good thing about this saw, or bad thing depending on who you talk to, is just how light it is. It's only 22 kilos, and honestly it feels a lot less than that. It does feel stable, but if you want a bit of extra support, Rutlands do also do a table saw stand on their website. It's only 50 quid, but at the time of buying this saw, they're currently out of stock, so I couldn't get one. So when I was looking to buy a table saw, it was between this and a DeWalt 7492. Now, if you put the two machines next to each other, they look very, very similar. And if you actually look at the specs, they're also fairly similar as well. The difference is this machine costs £295 and the DeWalt costs £800. I could get two saws for the price of a DeWalt, and I'd also have money left over to get a really good mitre gauge to go along with it. Now, the saw does come with a 3-year warranty, which I think is the standard for table saws nowadays. I did email Rutlands about getting spare parts for this machine. I haven't needed any spare parts, but I thought I'd ask the question anyway. And their response was they do not have spare parts. They only have parts that they get from table saws that they dismantle when people send them back to them because they're faulty. Because of that, I don't know how easy it is to get second-hand parts for this saw. Similarly, I don't know what table saws out there share the same parts as this machine as well. I suppose after 3 years when the warranty is finished, and there'll probably be a lot more parts out there, but for now, I'm not too sure how easily them parts are going to be. I'm only really making this video because there just isn't any coverage of a Rutlands table saw online. I think when I looked for it on YouTube, there was only one video of someone reviewing the table saw, and it wasn't fully in depth about how to adjust it. The manual on this machine isn't particularly good, so I felt that this video just had to be out there just to help you guys either consider getting this table saw, or you've already bought it and you need to make the adjustments to it. If you felt this video was helpful to you, or you just like the sound of my voice, then please consider liking the video and also going on my channel to subscribe. Like I said, I don't want this channel to be all about reviews. I'm just making this one-off video just to help you guys out there consider about buying one. If you have any questions about the table saw, then just pop in the comments below and I'll get around to it as soon as, and who knows, maybe I'll make a year review or something like this in the future and see how it holds up. But thank you guys for watching.